Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be speaking all about failure and dealing with failure. And joining us to talk about that topic is Lindsey Hamilton. Lindsey, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Dan, thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be here.
Super excited to have you on. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am the head of the mental conditioning department at IMG Academy, where I oversee 15 mental performance coaches to our student athlete body that makes up about 1,400 middle school and high school student athletes across 8 different sports. So basketball, football, baseball, track and field, soccer, lacrosse, tennis, volleyball upcoming, as well as other sports as well. So really have the privilege of leading a team of people that help support all of these athletes on the mental performance side.
I'm knackered listening to how many people you've got to lead and how many sports you're leading on. How did you get into sports psychology? Do you have an athletic background? Tell us a little bit about that.
I do have an athletic background. I played a variety of sports growing up, but settled on soccer when I played more competitively and into college as well.
Okay.
And I spent 10 years coaching on the sports side as well. When I was in my undergraduate degree, finishing my athletic career in college, I was recommended that I should try sports psychology, or that I should go on to sports psychology as a psychology major. And my immediate response was, I will never do sports psychology.
Oh, wow.
So first lesson of the day is never say never, I suppose. And yet my path took me in a variety of different industries. I was in research at Stanford University for a while. I worked in the automotive industry. I spent some time traveling, came back, ultimately found myself pursuing a master's degree in sports psychology. So here I am, had full intentions of really staying actually on the academic side, and doing research was for sure my background. I am one of those oddballs that do enjoy school. So I thought that might be the perfect fit. And I was blessed to have a mentor by the name of Dr. Nicole Detling, who encouraged me to try my hand here in the applied space, and I've never looked back. So I've been in the field. I've been at IMG Academy now for 8 years, and as a mental performance coach, I still work with teams here on campus and have the privilege of leading the whole of the team at this point.
Hey, if you'd asked me at 15, 16 years old what you want to do, my first response would have been professional golfer. My second response would have been a sports psychologist. So how comes you had that immediate repulsion to becoming a sports psychologist? Take me through that one.
Yeah, let's unpack that a little
Yeah.
bit. I think in many ways, a lot of us get into this field because we needed it, surely. So I had some of my own, approaches and challenges and so forth. I had an unfortunate history of injury that I think really draws a lot of people into the field, and thankfully so, because we have a lot of athletes that can benefit from that support and that experience. And I just felt it was too close to home. I felt like my heart was too tied to all of the ups and downs and the ins and outs and the injuries and the health and all the things. And I just felt like at the time it was better for me to step away from it or pursue the sport in a different fashion. And, I think my love for wanting to help people and being able to have that experience really is what drew me back into the sport space. So it's surely my passion now. I've definitely found myself in the right place, and I guess I needed to go on the journey before somebody told me it was the right one to be on.
You mentioned that you had 10 years of coaching experience. I always say that if I was to define myself as a half decent sports psychologist, I think it's in part because of the great experiences I had as a coach. I was a professional golfer and then a golf coach. And I think for me, the coaching experience was imperative. What's your thoughts on that? Do you feel that you're better as a sports psych having had coaching experience?
I vehemently agree. I think without question, it provides a lens on the game to help you better understand the demands and understand the mental demands of, different decision making. And, you understand the rigor that the athletes are going under and what they're being asked of. I think the reality is too that no nobody plays in isolation of their coach. And so understanding the demands that the coaches are under and also the demands of that the athletes are under with regard to their coach, I think having that experience has certainly helped me navigate spaces better, introduce conversations better, being able to in my current work, I have a real emphasis on applying the skills in the sporting environment themselves. So not only being able to understand the game from a coach's perspective, but then knowing how to work with the coaches, having been a coach, understanding what all I might be taking into consideration from that perspective too. So creating relationships through there to be better able to do the work. I think coaching experience has had a profound effect on the work I do now.
I think that last point is particularly pertinent. All your points were important there, but that last point is particularly pertinent in as much as when you've been a coach, you do have a strong appreciation for the technical, tactical, and physical pieces. And as sports psychologists, I mean, you spoke earlier about being very much into the academic side of things. And when we research, we tend to be reductionist, don't we, for a reason, because we're trying to isolate a certain psychological construct and study that. But hey, when we go out there and we're actually consulting, we really need to take a holistic approach. And I think when you've been a coach and you've seen the world through the lens of a coach, and you have coached technically, tactically, physically, I just think there's that potential advantage as a sports psychologist for having experienced that and having built a knowledge base around the technical, tactical, and physical components.
Yeah, without question. And I mean, in my current work right now, I'm also pursuing my doctorate degree, and so doing my dissertation work, and I'm running an intervention to evaluate its effectiveness. And of course, it's not going as I planned it, because that's how life works here in the applied setting. That schedules change and courts aren't available, and travel schedule all of a sudden makes it so this session that was supposed to happen didn't, and yet you still have to continue to move forward and make an impact. And while it's maddening that my sessions aren't done and I can't continue to move forward in the way that I would have proposed, that's no different from any other year. And so hopefully the research in and of itself will be more applicable to people who are actually able to conduct their interventions because of that applied differences. So I really appreciate that. And I'm a full believer that our work should be guided by the research and with evidence. And so I think marrying those two more closely is really to the advantage of us all.
You're at the IMG Academy, and as you mentioned, I think you said you were leading something like 14 mental skills coaches, and a number of sports. As a leader, as the head of mental conditioning, do you still get the opportunity to get your hands dirty? Are you doing many sessions during the day, or is it just purely a leadership role for you now?
Oh, it is. I definitely have the opportunity to get my hands dirty. I currently I serve as the mental performance coach for 5 teams currently. And so that is a great undertaking, and it's wonderful, and I really appreciate it. While my bandwidth is extremely stretched, I just really value being able to stay in the work so that I can help lead from the perspective of being boots on the ground as well, and not just making assumptions about what the work is anymore, because surely it's ever evolving, and how we go about structuring and delivering and evaluating our work is constantly changing in a variety of ways too. So being in touch with that, I think, is really helpful. I also lead our mental performance training for our corporate work and our executives that come on campus. And so that keeps me in touch with the delivery and in touch with understanding mental demands in a different environment as well. So I really value that change. I do value being able to work with a different audience and also adults, whereas most of my work right now is with higher level kids. But staying in touch with that, I find, helps me to stay in touch with my staff as well as they continue to do the work.
And before we do get on to our main topic of the day, which is failure and dealing with failure and managing oneself through failure, just would like to unpack the team, if you're able to share the teams you're actually working with. You mentioned 5 teams. What sports are they from?
So currently, I'm only working in basketball. This
Okay,
is my first. I have worked with a variety of the teams,
of
the programs
course,
here on
of
campus.
course,
So
yeah.
this season, I am wholly in basketball. I work with both on the boys' side and on the girls' side. I work with our developmental teams as well as our national level teams. So I appreciate, while I'm only in one sport, that I still get the opportunity to have a diverse array of student athletes who are in that sport along the way. So.
Was that a deliberate choice, Lindsey, or was that something planned for you or by you?
It was a deliberate choice, although
Okay.
Potentially not what I expected my choice to be. So we just got to a point where we had some shift in personnel in basketball. We had a need for a mental coach to be in basketball. At the time, I was serving primarily in soccer alongside some other sports as well. And we had some great practitioners in soccer that could move forward and take the reins. And we found a gap in basketball, and I slid over to support in that program. So it's certainly not my intuitive sport in terms of what my background is, but it's been an incredible experience over these years learning the new demands of a new sport, which ultimately I feel has made me a better practitioner because I can't rely on my own sporting experience. I get the opportunity to ask better questions to understand the situation better. So basketball was not really not off the table, surely, but certainly wasn't where my comfort zone was. But I suppose that's part of this failing conversation as well.
It's a challenge, isn't it, when you don't necessarily know the language of the
Mm-hmm.
sport, and necessarily whilst obviously athletes have the similar challenges across all sports when it comes to performance and learning and mental health and well-being, there can still be sport specific challenges, can't there, that
Sure.
you've got to learn. But it does, you are obviously a wonderful soccer player, you're in basketball, there's still that invasion team sport element, the manipulation of space, ball,
Yeah.
players, anticipation, decision making, etc., etc. All those cognitive skills thrown into alongside the mental skills. So there's some relationship there, isn't there?
Without question, especially because of some of the similarities across the two sports. If you'd have put me in tennis,
Yeah.
there's a reason why I didn't stay in that sport. But yeah, there are some similarities which I can appreciate drawing from. And you do make a good point that the language is really a significant contributor to those differences, and being able to gain credibility and build rapport through the appropriate language is valuable, as well as the culture. Just the different cultures of sports are different, and making sure that we can navigate that space in a way that's authentic while still contributing to the culture and not disrupting the positive parts of those cultures, but learning with them as well. So yeah, lots of similarities and lots of opportunities to learn new ways to do it as well.
Now, I reached out to you several weeks ago. We follow each other on Twitter, and at the end of October, the AASP convention conference was going on. I think it was in Texas this year, wasn't it? Am I right
It
in thinking
was.
it was
Yes,
in
it was.
Texas? I
It
was
was our first time back since COVID.
right. This is where Twitter is wonderful, because whether it was the convention in Italy, the European Sports Psychology Convention in Italy earlier this year, the recent BPS Sports Psychology Convention, or the AASP in October, it's a wonderful way. Twitter is a wonderful way to follow these conventions. And I saw you post a picture of yourself and some colleagues, and you had delivered a presentation there, which was entitled "The Failures That Guided Us, Sharing Vulnerabilities in Ascending to the Elite Level." I think when you put the word failure up in lights, sports psychologists tends to orient towards that and go, yes, learning opportunities. It's just something. It's like it holds a magnet to us. It draws us. It draws us in. So you delivered this presentation alongside the very fantastic Dr. Mustafa Sarkar, who's a regular on this show, Dr. Hilary Corthen, and Dr. Adam Naylor. I'm right in saying that. And I reached out because I wanted to have a chat with you about it. I'd love to
Mhm.
unpack this presentation. I know that this was predominantly about sports psychologists and dealing with failure as a sports psychologist, but we've agreed that we'll talk about that, but we're also going to broaden out this conversation around failure today. But just, perhaps start by giving us an introduction as to the genesis of this presentation. Why a presentation on failure at the psychology convention?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. So when Trey McCullough reached out, who was the moderator of the panel, for us to have this discussion around, I think that the genesis of the conversation really was, you go to these conferences, we learn about all these skills and strategies that we can implement. We learn about the great work that people are doing. We are surrounded by people that we admire and we want to learn from and be like in some way. And then we forget, or it's easy to oversight all of the reality of how any of us got into that space and how we were able to share information that is productive. And inevitably, a lot of it probably had failure along the way. And so what we wanted to do in this conversation was have a have a real authentic conversation around failure. And you are 100% right when you said we hear failure and we think learning opportunity and we think growth and we think development, which inevitably was a lot of what the audience was reflecting back to us of when they think about failure, what do we think about? And because we are in the field that we're in as mental performance coaches, we almost feel an obligation to not really lean into the hard part of failure and what does it actually feel like and how do you go through it, and for in some cases grieve through it and ultimately to be able to grow through it and with it into the next space. And that was what our conversation was centered around and why we felt it was important to bring to the conference. And I was delighted because our presentation was slated for the very last day at 8 o'clock in the morning, when surely everybody has enjoyed a delightful evening of networking the night
Oh,
before.
yes.
But we were pleased that a lot of people attended it at that time on that final day, and I think that's a testament to people's desire to learn and understand failure better for themselves, and also to be able to share those learnings with the athletes that we work with that are encountering failure all the time.
I've done some of those 8 in the morning convention presentations, and there tends to be tumbleweed. It's myself and just a couple of other people who are slumped on their chair with sunglasses on after a heavy night before.
That is exactly right. And I would love to give a shout out to the mental conditioning team from IMG who was at the conference, who all attended, whether out of obligation or interest. I will not commit to answer, but they were wonderful in support, and I appreciated that.
See, it's all about team.
That's
That's just great task and social cohesion. That's awesome.
Exactly.
Practicing what you preach. Hey, look, if I'd been in a room and I'd been watching yourself and Muz and Adam and Hillary, was it just a case of the four of you sharing your experiences of failure? How did you go about? How did you construct this presentation?
Yeah, we actually initiated the conversation around just our philosophy around failure.
Okay.
And what failure means to us, and whether or not we see failure. And some people were of the approach of like, absolutely, I see failure, like that is what we do, that's a part of what we experience and so forth, whereas other people, myself as an example, was I don't actually see it as failure, because I personally see failure as final. So if we're not final, we haven't failed yet. And so for me, I don't personally relate to failure. It has been my experience that the athletes that I work with more often than not don't relate to failure, because when we try to position mistakes as failure, that feels all of a sudden really ominous to them. Now, surely not making the team, getting cut from the roster, where they, careers are ending in some fashion, like failure is a much more relevant construct to them in that time. But I really appreciated being able to have that distinction between some people feeling failure and understanding mistakes and challenges and things that didn't work out as failure to them. And whereas other of us maybe had an approach of failure being something different than how do we manage mistakes? How do we get through situations that didn't favor us and move forward through them as well? So that's really where we started the conversation.
When you say you don't relate to failure, do you mean you don't relate to the word failure, the concept of failure, that you use this word mistake, that rather than the word failure, you talk to yourself and to others about mistakes? Is that what you're saying to me?
Yeah, I think I do understand failure to be a thing, to be a construct. I don't relate to anything that doesn't go my way, or that where I really didn't measure up.
Yes.
Right, where you set yourself out to achieve something, and it doesn't happen, it doesn't execute, you don't succeed. I personally don't see lack of success as failure, and so when I think of failure in that construct, I don't relate to it. However, what I do relate to, which is where we also centered much of the conversation around, is how it feels, right? How failure actually feels. Whether I perceive that as I set out to do this big grand thing and it fell flat on its face, I feel that as a failure, even though I don't, or what other people might relate to as failure, even though in my mind I don't tie that terminology to it. So that was a lot of what we spent our time talking about, as well as what does failure feel like, and how do you navigate those feelings of loss or failure or not succeeding in the process as well.
So would you say if we were to persist with this word failure, although one could
Mhm.
substitute it for the experience of making mistakes, and being a psychologist, it immediately makes me think of just a cognitive restructuring. There, I'm shifting shifting the language to change my perception of the situation. I'm psychologically flexing. It strikes me that when one experiences mistakes and or failure, that there are two potential dimensions at play here. There's a cognitive dimension maybe, and there's an affect and emotional dimension. What I'm hearing you say is, in a presentation, you explored that emotional dimension, how it felt. And I suppose my question is, do you think that that's the one that we all as human beings and athletes in their role, that's the one that is the most sensitive, that's the experience that's the most sensitive experience?
I would say so, just because of that human element. I think one
Mm,
of the things that separates that from the cognitive restructuring piece of it is I don't know that everybody needs to cognitively restructure failure.
mm,
So we have, when you have this experience and you identify this concept as failure, and then we have to work to see how we can get better from it. And so we're cognitively restructuring our relationship to what happened. It's been my experience that not everybody has to go through that process to get the benefits of failure. So cognitive restructuring in some way can be selective. I don't know many people who put all of themselves on the line and fall short, not feel some type of way about it, right? Like not feel a disappointment, at the extent maybe a shame or a guilt, a disappointment, to even just like, oh, that didn't work out, like some sort of feeling and emotion to it. So I think to that extent, understanding the emotional side of the failure was probably something we resonated with in the conversation. And I think there's so much value in cognitive restructuring, because ultimately, how do we get the fruit, the benefit, the how do we get to the next phase from the failure? And we have to be able to cognitively understand that, but not everybody needs to restructure it to get there. So I think maybe that's where the emotional side of it just seemed to really resonate in the conversation we were having.
and so for you as a practitioner working with athletes, do you find that helping athletes reinterpret the feelings that they're experiencing, post failure, after mistakes, after big mistakes, is your first port of call, or is it just a general conversation with them? Is it giving them the space to talk about it? What's your
Mhm.
experiences as a practitioner?
Surely, when I'm working with athletes who are enduring failure in some capacity, as a practitioner who comes from more of an act based approach, I certainly take the time, the intentional time, to make sure that there is space for the emotions to be occurring before any cognitive restructuring that might be needed to move forward, to allow that to happen, as needed, and to allow them to feel those feelings so that they can be aware of them, so they can name them, so they can have an experience with that and not feel like they have to shove them away to get to the learning of it. And so that is certainly my first approach, is to allow that space to be. And sometimes that can happen in a conversation, and sometimes that happens over a number of conversations. And sometimes we get into cognitive restructuring from there and come back to it because of the way the feelings can be present even as we are cognitively restructuring. So it's very important to me that there's space made for those feelings, and to acknowledge those feelings and allow those feelings to be there. That would certainly be my first protocol when working with failure with athletes.
In your experience, have you found that athletes find it easy to learn from failure?
I would say, easy is a tough word to describe that experience by. I would say it's not unreasonable. It's not unrealistic that my experience has said, yes, our athletes can learn from failure. And it has been my experience where that's been the case. The question is, are they able to apply those learnings? And are they able to use those learnings to manage the residual emotion? So I don't know that that is always the case, that the learnings are applied. I think at least for the athletes that I have had the experience with, they understand the benefits. They understand what they got from it. They can even tell you what they would do as a result. And yet when they get put back into a situation, it's still a task of how their training and development has gone through that learning to be able to identify if they can apply that now in the new space. And if emotions arise, are they able to lean into those learnings as opposed to get stuck in their feelings when they are experiencing things similar to that original failure?
And whether as a psychologist or a coach, do you think it's advisable to approach athletes directly and start a conversation if that athlete has made some mistakes, has experienced some failure, or do you think it's wiser or smarter to allow the athlete to approach the coach or approach the sports psychologist?
I appreciate that question. I think my approach is going to be really contextual. So there's a handful of things where I think context plays a role in what this answer might be, at least in my experience. One would be it depends on the failure and the timing. So if somebody has failed on a big pressure situation in the middle of a game that's still occurring and someone's caught up in themselves and they need and like right there it needs to be addressed because the game's going on, right? We need to be able to move forward. We need you to be able to apply your skills and contribute to the team. We don't have as much luxury to wait for them to work through it on their own. Whereas if somebody has been cut from the team or somebody had a miserable game and now we need to follow on from it, we have a little bit more processing time. We can wait a little bit more for that conversation to be had in one way or the other. So certainly the environment in which the failure has occurred and the necessary next steps is going to play a role in that answer. Whether or not that person is approached or whether we wait for them to come, I think that answer is going to be dependent on the support they have. So if that person is being supported through this failure, is it necessary that they immediately go to the coach to have that conversation? Not necessarily. Is it valuable? For sure, it could always be valuable depending on the relationship with the coach and what the failure is and so forth. That open line of communication is always helpful. But if that athlete is being supported through this and they're having functional behaviors thereafter, then it might not be a need. If that athlete is struggling continually, that they're engaging in now non-functional behavior, right? That they're interacting with their performance space in a way that's not productive, or they simply are not being supported emotionally as a result of this, or whether it's because of the failure or not, then I would say it's incumbent upon the coaches or the sports psychology professional to go and provide that support because they're still a person. They're still first and foremost, right? That they deserve care, even whatever the mistake might be. And, I think that we have a responsibility in our profession to serve supporting these as people and then performers. So, that might be a determinant of whether or not I would approach the conversation or allow that conversation to come to me.
As you're speaking there, it's making me think of individual differences, and I don't think I'm going to be able to formulate a question here, but it was making me think of, when I think of individual differences, I might think of attitudinal differences, difference in attitude towards success and failure and what they mean to people, to athletes, and I suppose personality differences. Perhaps somebody who's more sensitive to negative information around self, as opposed to somebody who perhaps is better able to deal with critiquing the self. Yeah, no question, but just a thought there.
Yeah, I think it's a really important difference, which is challenging, right? We come on these conversations and we want people to be able to walk away with something they can do or a question they can ask of a certain athlete, which hopefully we can get into some of those as well. But the reality is every person, every failure, every context is different in which failure occurs. I have recently we had a team that lost a game, which was a nail biter, and you never want to be on the losing end of those. And the ways in which the people on the team handled that loss or what they might perceive as that failure was wholly different. Whether or not they were all the starting five people, all starting five or however many people might be on the team at that time, handle that loss different. And there are some people who can take it really personally because their performance is so tied to everything they give of themselves, everything of who they are. And, they needed to grieve through that differently. And yet I felt really comfortable with this one athlete in particular who was having a very hard time with it, because I know that she's able to come back tomorrow knowing she still has a lot to contribute, that she is still somebody who is not defined by that failure. So while she handled the failure very hard, it was very short lived. Right? Whereas there might be other people who seemingly are flying underneath the radar and they're not being outward about it. They're just kind of observing what's going on. But then internally, they're having this dialogue of, maybe I shouldn't be here. If I can't win that game, what difference does it make? Right? They start to have this internal dialogue that's not helpful to them as performers, and maybe even extending to not helpful to them in value of their own worth, right? As people. And so I think that those individuals it really does matter. We might be able to look at them, a coach might say, oh, that person's really struggling with this, you need to go talk to them. I'm like, not necessarily. Like, I think we need to make room for how people do deal with the failures that they experience, and how they're likely to move from that before we just assume there's a blanket way to approach people who might not be behaving in the way that we would want them to.
I do sometimes wonder if, broad brush statement here, the way our athletes, so a basketball team is a small team as compared to, say, a rugby team here in England, 15 in the team with roll-on subs. So there's plenty of players in the squad. So for a coach having to deal with X amount of players, I do sometimes wonder if a real skill of coaching within one's own coaching environment is to set up a situation, probably asking for the impossible here, but setting up a situation whereby we are so task oriented, the players and the team are so into their tasks that the outcome, the consequence of the outcome is reduced, it's diminished, the sensitivity of the outcome is reduced, because our players, as coaches, we help players be task focused, action oriented, self-regulating, and really there, blinkers on there, rather than outcome. I wonder sometimes if setting up that kind of environment and helping players focus on those, have that kind of mindset, enables them to reduce or turn down the volume of anxiety around failure if we then do fail.
Yeah, I think I think there's a lot at play there. And I think the coach's approach to what they're comfortable with in terms of managing mistakes and failure in the middle of performance, right? Are they, are they able to, or are they willing to allow a mistake to occur so that we can form some momentum and so forth? Or is it, this isn't working, we need to make a change immediately? I also have wondered, kind of to your point, Dan, like that is in so many ways constrained by the very sport that they're in. So you mentioned 5 people on a basketball team, far more on a rugby team. I'm thinking of the World Cup right now, where generally speaking, yes, we have, right now they have 5 subs because we're still in the middle of play. But generally speaking, they have 3 subs over across 90 minutes. Like, you don't have the choice as a coach to pull somebody because they made a mistake, right? And so the self-regulation that then is inherently taught through that, because there is no other option. You have to work through your mistake. You will stay on the field. And so sometimes even the environment can produce or demand a response to failure simply because of that. But to your point about when I do make a mistake and how I'm feeling about that anticipation, I mean, I came off a session this morning. I was working with a basketball team where we were doing a 3-point shooting competition, and the ultimate determinant was how many buckets can you make when you can only miss 3 shots.
Okay.
Right? So you make a few, you miss a shot, no problem. You make a few more, you miss a shot, no problem. You miss the third, that's how many you have, right? And you keep track of your things. And talking through just the player's experience of, what are you thinking when you know you have more shots to miss? That you can take more shots after this failure? And how is that thinking differently when you feel like, as soon as I miss this, I'm done? And so how many times do we go into our games thinking, if I miss this, coach is going to pull me, right? If I make this mistake, I'm not good enough. Whereas if we can go into our space and think, okay, like if I take this shot, I can take another.
Yeah.
Right. And so how is that thought process different? So ultimately, how can we get ourselves back to the space where if I miss this shot, I can take another? And being able to use some skills and strategies in there, because those experiences are so real. Whether we are imposing those constraints on ourselves or the game is doing that for us, being able to manage that is an important part of our mental game and handling it.
Which places an onus on the coach, again, coming back to this, coming back to the coach's environment, coming back to the coaching processes within their practice, places the onus on the coach to give players more leeway to make mistakes,
Yes.
To retain a sense of patience themselves, give players the opportunity to make mistakes or give them the space to make mistakes, and retain consistent coaching behaviors so players don't necessarily have an emotional reaction following mistakes.
Correct. Yeah, I think that becomes really important, and I think so many coaches and so many different environments understand that mistakes are a part of the game, that we need to endure them and learn from them and grow with them, and that they're going to happen. Most understand that. Surely there are some very high pressure do or die moments where we don't have the luxury, at a very elite levels where lots of money's on the line, like coaches' jobs are on the line, like they might have a different approach because we're not coaching developmental teams, or maybe we're getting focused on this game instead of the long-term approach that we're trying to take. So that's understandable. I think, what I would love to support coaches in doing is helping them as coaches manage mistakes more so in practice than in the games, because my observations have been across a variety of coaches in a variety of different sports is, as coaches, we really like our practices to be clean. We really like our practices to be sharp, because if they're sharp and clean here, then it's going to show up better in the game. And because of that desire for practices to be clean and to be sharp and for exercises to be run well, then we do harp on every mistake, or we have a tendency maybe to hold on to those mistakes because it's messy and it's clean and we can do this better. Try it again, do it again. No, that's not good. Do it again. And so if we can help our coaches and ourselves be more comfortable with mistakes and managing mistakes in those practices, one, it's more like the game anyway, because the mistakes are going to show up. Two, we're not coaching a culture of mistakes being not permissible, right? That or the ideal that no mistakes will happen, and if they do it, you need to redo it. We don't get that luxury in sport. We don't get the luxury. In fact, I was working with a musician at one point who was auditioning for a big seat in this performance. She played viola, and she practiced all the time. It was beautiful. Like, it was wonderful. Like, I have rarely seen someone so committed to their craft. And unfortunately, she completely tanked the audition. And in reflecting on it, she realized that every time she made a mistake when she was playing, she'd start the piece again, right? The drill breaks down, let's start the drill again. The play breaks down, let's start it from the top, right? And then we are surprised when our teams, our groups don't know how to work through a broken down play, right? Even they don't know how to work through resetting from the middle of the field instead of coming out from the back, right? And so I think I would love to be able to support coaches in more of identifying what their philosophy is to failure in practice, and how does that actually show up in practice, and what benefits will we then get from managing failure in the game.
What does that look like?
I think that it looks messy, if I'm being totally honest. It looks like being okay with the plays breaking down and asking people, if we were going to take like a constraints-based learning approach to this work, it's the play breaking down, and then instead of saying, okay, redo it, it's saying, well, what happened there? Right? And so maybe there's some self-learning going on through that failure that we can take. Conversely, it could be the play breaking down and not saying anything, allowing the whole play of the outcome to unfold. And then being able to identify, okay, how could we have done that better? Where was that mistake, right? Because then we know that we take on the mistake as a part of the play. I mean, there's a reason that so much of soccer is in contest, right? We see in the World Cup right now that when they're showing different possession percentages, we have this new in contest percentage, because inevitably at some point someone doesn't have the ball, whether because it was stripped from them, it got turned over, it was a missed shot, what have you. Inherent in that is mistake, right? And so when so much of the game occurs in that way, we want to be able to emotionally navigate that. And if I know that I am able to continue the play even when mistake occurs, how am I going to respond to that in a game? Probably like it's commonplace, right? That a mistake happens, I got to get back on defense immediately. Not mistake happens, oh no, I'm going to be taken out. Oh no, the play's no longer valid because I have to restart. Right? And so there's, in practice, I think, making space for the learning to occur on behalf of the athlete, making maybe even space for still reflecting on mistake. I by no means say that we should be tolerant of subpar performance, right? Like that's the whole point of this. If we're going to make error, let's be elite enough to learn from it, and be able to get and use it to where we want it to get to us. So I don't want to condone mistakes as commonplace, and yet as often as they happen, how can we gain a competitive advantage from being the best at learning from them, and not making people feel like when they make a mistake, they are no longer valid, their play is no longer valid, their work's no longer valid, we need to restart.
I love everything you're saying there, and it's interesting that you said one shouldn't necessarily be tolerant on performance mistakes or necessarily condone performance mistakes. And I don't want to put words into your mouth, so please correct me if in a second if I've got that wrong. But I do wonder sometimes if there's a bit of a paradox at play. I often say to coaches just to challenge them, because I think coaches, especially at the elite and adult elite and the developing elite, coaches, we are so socialized into tough on performance, missing the we're tough on performance and tolerant on mindset. Because of what you're saying, because if the performance is wrong, if the pattern of play that's being worked on is wrong, we start again, because we're trying to be tough on performance, because we want to get it right on game day. But actually what that's doing is that's being tolerant on mindset, because you're not giving players the opportunity, you're not giving people the opportunity to practice self-regulating and deal with chaos and deal with mistakes. I wonder sometimes if it is actually taking this word tolerant and reversing it and saying, I'm going to be tolerant on performance here in as much as I'm going to tolerate mistakes, but I'm going to be damn tough on mindset, because what I want to see is responses, reactions, skillful, psychologically flexed responses in that moment to those performance breakdowns.
Yeah, I love what you're saying here. And I think the implications of that are huge at all levels, at elite levels, at developmental levels. I am privileged. I can think of a coach right now that I work with that does exactly what you say, right? Is tolerant on mistake and very hard on mindset, because ultimately of our controllability in there, right? He's talking all the time about what we can control, and all those kinds of things, which I love. I think it's interesting. I think sometimes sports psychology professionals get a bad rap because we are the ones who are saying, but what can you learn from the mistake? Right? As if to say, we're okay making them, everybody. Let's go ahead and learn from it, right? Which is not what we're saying. Right? It's not that we are okay making mistakes. We are just very understanding that they do happen, and so we have to take advantage of that. And so, to your point, I think if we flipped that script on what we're tolerant of, it would be game changing. Now, of course, you still want to be tough on performance because there's a standard to be met, surely. Which is where I think people then feel like sports psychs are okay with just, do give your best effort, which yes, please do. And yet we know that at various levels, like that's not sufficient to accomplish what we need to accomplish. It makes me wonder when we are managing mistakes as coaches, what is it that like clarifying really what's our objective here? Is this perfect pass the thing that you need to be nailing? Or is it the thing that this pass is contributing to that we want to be working toward? And sometimes I wonder if, when we break down the technique of what we're trying to accomplish versus the overall accomplishment, that we're trying to achieve, how that can blind us from being tolerant of mistakes. And what I love, there's so much research around body, like motor mechanics, and just cognitive work in terms of what we're learning and all these kinds of things, where you ask someone to hammer a nail 20 times, they're not going to hammer the nail the same way 20 times. Like, we just know that to be true. And yet we have this ideal that if we just get this technique perfectly the way it should be done, then everything else will fall into place. Well, unfortunately, we're all setting each other up for success, pretending that that's a thing, because this one technique is not the thing. You could know as a pro golfer that you could swing the same club 20 times on the ball with the same desired outcome, and it wouldn't be the same 20 swings. Right? There's going to be some differences in there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think by making room for some of these differences and acknowledging that to be the case, then we can just be more clear on, well, what is it we're actually trying to accomplish? And are we making this pass the way that we need to be making this pass? If you are turning it over 5 times in a row, okay, let's address something here, right? Like, we need to figure out how we're going to learn through this, because the learning that we're trying to do hasn't worked yet. And I do want to make space for the fact that everybody does learn differently, and yet we need to make sure learning is occurring. But I think that is going to guide how we handle, how we consume failure, and what are we comfortable with in terms of getting through that failure, is really having an understanding of what is it we're really trying to accomplish here, and can we continue to accomplish that with mistake along the way.
We got plenty of sports psychs listening in, but we've also got lots and lots of coaches listening in, and those who are invested in helping players improve and manage themselves around mistakes and failure, if we're going to use that word. And earlier you alluded to having a conversation about what we can ask athletes when we sit down and do have a conversation with them about mistakes and failure, how we can manage that conversation. As a sports psychology consultant, I know that when I sit down with an athlete, there's often a reason, and those conversations aren't always easy, and we as sports psychs are trained in various frameworks to guide us through those conversations. But for those coaches listening in, if they're sitting down on the bench next to a player who's let's say emotionally engulfed in that moment, made mistakes, is feeling pretty low, how can a coach instigate an effective and efficacious conversation? How does that start, and what does that potentially look like?
That's such a good question. And I think it actually starts a step in advance and before initiating that conversation. And one of the things that we have found here over time in the work that we do, we as of course doing these like mental assessment profiles and getting an understanding of how people see themselves in their performance. One of the things that stood out to me a number of years ago was the number of people who say, when I make a mistake, I feel like my worth decreases. The number of people who admit to that, or to say they feel some sense of that, was shocking to me. And these are kids ranging from 12 to 18 at elite levels, at recreational levels, developmental, all across the board. The number of people who admitted, when I don't perform well, I feel like less than a person, was shocking to me. And so I think as a coach, just having that awareness matters. Because if we don't understand that these athletes are tying themselves so closely as people to how they are performing, then we can't approach that conversation in any way that is going to be helpful. Because if we just tell people to tie their shoes and move on, we haven't made space for how they're actually feeling, which is a problem, right? Like, if you don't feel like you're worth anything now, how are you going to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and go on and try again? Now, does that mean that you get pulled off and you're on the bench and someone's sulking and you need to have this like existential conversation about how much you're worth? No, we don't. But it's very important for coaches to just have that awareness. Now, of course, like there are some people that just like need more support emotionally, right? Like they don't have emotion regulation, and coaches need to generate those conversations in different ways. So again, depending on when the coach is able to have that conversation, I think would determine how to approach it, right? Like asking, just in some ways, if you have the time and space as coaches, asking, like, why don't you walk me through how you're feeling right now? And which I will say, I appreciate. I have a very good friend of mine who uses this approach all the time. He always says, well, walk me through this, because you're inviting them onto this journey and you're telling them I want to be on them. If you instead say, why are you upset? Right? It creates a lot of defensiveness. Why, right? You insinuate you shouldn't be feeling this way, right? But you ultimately want to know what's going on, right? How did we get here? How are you feeling? Right? And so we can initiate that conversation more effectively by saying, walk me through, how you're feeling about this right now, or walk me through what has got you into this place, as opposed to, why are you upset? So I think asking those questions differently can be helpful. It's certainly the case where if somebody's on the bench and you're in the middle of the game and you can't have that conversation, that obviously player personnel is going to be an important decision maker at that time. Is that a person that just needs to breathe on their own for a quick second, and then you can come over and say, hey, we got a lot of game left, let's keep going? Or is that someone that you need to go and sit by and say, I know that you're upset about this. I'm more than happy to walk through this with you when the game's over. I need you to be doing this right now, and I'm here with you. Can we collaborate on this? Right? Like, you have to know who you can leave alone and who you need to approach as a coach. But in order for that coach to make an impact anywhere along that line, it's necessary for them to understand that way too many kids are tying their performance to their value, and that just being aware that that's the case.
That classic identity foreclosure, isn't it? I am Dan the golfer, I am Lindsey the soccer player, and so subsequently every experience we have revolves around that foreclosed identity. We had a great conversation on the Sports Soak show with Rebecca Levitt about that some time ago, and I love what you said there in terms of just an opening statement. Not a question, but just a statement. Hey, walk me through this. And as you were describing that to me, it was making me think of the importance of coaches understand that, because again, socialization here again. Coaches are so socialized into solution finding or being solution oriented, aren't they? And I think we probably all are to a degree. It's actually okay to, I think anyway, it's okay to understand as a coach that you don't necessarily have to walk away from this conversation with a player, a person having a solution. It could just be helping them offload and you just being there to listen to them, right?
Absolutely. And what I think is so important to remember here is we don't support each other just because it makes us feel warm and fuzzy inside, right? Like you look at failure literature, social support is a significant one that's going to help people navigate failure. It's going to help people navigate unregulated emotions. Like when people feel like someone's got their back, we know that to be a huge determinant in their success in navigating this difficult situation. And so when a coach is stepping into that space as that social support, ultimately, like what a huge opportunity, not only for them to help potentially provide skills to navigate them through this, but they in and of themselves are serving as one of the strategies to help somebody in this by just reaching out a hand. And so, when coaches do step into this space to help in this environment, I mean, they're really working on it's a 2-for-1. Right? It's a 2-for-1 by being able to support them in the space, but they can walk away from that conversation without the kid or player or athlete having understood or changed, and they will have still made a difference because of that social support that they simply were able to navigate through. And that is going to continue to grow and be cultivated through that developed relationship. So, when coaches want it to be rectified, right? They want that solution in that space. They want to be able to have a conversation with the kid. The kid perks up, chin is up, and I'm ready to go take on the next one. And surely we feel disappointed when it's not that the case every time. But I think that, to give solace to the fact that when coaches just serve in that role, that in and of itself is a massive contributor to mistake management.
To close our conversation today, I'd be curious to get your opinion on this, because I've read this somewhere that it's easier. It's easier for human beings to learn from success rather than from failure, because as human beings we can tend to protect our ego, and so sometimes when we fail we close off to the cues and the clues around us that gives us an idea of why we failed, whereas when we succeed we're potentially more open to those cues and clues as to what it was that helped us succeed. Do you think in sport, learning from failure is almost a cliche now, isn't it? Or learning from mistakes is almost a cliche.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt that you can learn from mistakes, failure, but are we absent from talking enough about learning from success, that actually that success is our golden opportunity to really learn from?
You know what? Wholeheartedly. And I have a good friend, another sports site consultant, Ben Ehrlich. I don't know if you've heard the phrase "sometimes you win, sometimes you learn."
Yeah.
He despises that because he's like, you should be learning all the time.
Yes.
And it's true. We should be learning from our wins. We should be able to identify what are the things that we do well, because if not, I mean, it's very challenging to have consistency if you can't bring back to the table the thing that worked in the first place.
Yeah.
It's very hard to build confidence when you're unclear about what works and what you're strong at. And so learning from successes is very true. And not just because we feel good about it. Surely we're open to it, but the research would say the same, that when we are looking back on our failures and the things that we need to do better versus groups that are looking back on their failures, but also being able to identify the things that worked well, that we learn faster and more effectively when we're willing to look at both sides of the coin. And so some people are like, oh, whatever, I don't need to look at my success. Like, I'm just going to look at that margin of gain I need and where do I need to get better. But learning from successes is a massive competitive advantage, and simply asking yourself, what went well in that?
Yep.
What did I do well?
Yep.
Right? I mean, a lot of our self-talk is even framed around the things that we do well.
Yep.
Right? Or the things that we are striving toward, that we want to be aspiring to, that we're already moving on the right track towards. So we know the advantages that focusing on success has. And it's often overlooked because it feels cheesy, right? Or a lot of elite athletes are concerned that it's going to make them complacent, which has not been demonstrated in the literature at this time, but is still a valid concern of our athletes. So helping our athletes learn from failure, but also cultivating a really deliberate approach to learning from our successes is a huge competitive advantage.
Fascinating stuff. And to close, to slightly put you on the spot as a closing question, a double question here. As a sports psychologist, we're often, as we've repeatedly said today, talking to coaches and players about learning from failure. Is that something that you feel that you were naturally and are naturally good at? Is it something that you've had to work hard at over the years to improve upon? And my second question there would be, for those listening in, what would be one bit of advice? And then you could just reinforce something that you've spoken about today already, but one bit of advice for those listening in around dealing with failure and learning, I suppose, through mistakes and failure.
Certainly. So I definitely think that learning from failure and successes requires deliberate practice.
Okay.
Inevitably, when we're succeeding, we don't feel like we want to take the time for it. And when we're failing, we don't want our hearts to have to spend any more time there than it already does. So it's not something, I think it's something that has to be cultivated deliberately. It is something that I have worked on deliberately in the course of my time as a practitioner to try to be able to better serve my student athletes, but also to be able to put myself in a situation in which I am asking them to do as well. I would say that doing so is challenged when we have this emotional tie to it. And so when just because I feel really bad about how this went, and just because I'm very uncomfortable going through this reflective process, doesn't mean I'm not reflecting well. And so I think we need to know ourselves to know, am I in an emotional place to be able to do this reflection? Am I in an emotional place to learn from this failure right now, and being honest with ourselves? And just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not right. And so being clear with that, I suppose that could be part of my advice or my guidance is to really just be honest with yourself. Like, am I in a place to receive all of the gifts this failure has to offer me? And if I'm not, then honoring that and taking a breath and potentially setting up some timelines or time frames in which you're going to challenge yourself to return to it and so forth. That is a way that's safe for you. But, just being really honest about being in a place to gain the learning of it in and of itself. I would say to help manage some of that really ineffective thinking that comes when failure arises, surely, as it often does. I think the one simple question that I have always really leaned on, and my athletes have claimed to really appreciate it themselves, is this thought helpful? Because it's not asking if it's true. You might have actually been awful at what you just did. So to say, "Ooh, is that true? I'm not interested in that right now." But is it helpful? I don't know. And if the answer to that question is yes, this is helpful, then you are in a place to be productive in reflecting on that. You are in a place to gain the learning from that because you are saying, yes, this is true. This is helpful to me. I can move forward here. If you are in a place where that answer is it's not helpful, then oftentimes I have seen athletes be able to lessen the grip on it just enough to breathe through it and to get to a place that is more productive as well. So asking, is this thought helpful when you're in the spiral, and being honest about yourself when you are, so that you can really glean the benefits of the failure when you're ready to take them on, would be some of the things that have helped me in the long enduring practice of reflecting on the failure.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Lindsey, thank you very much. That was an awesome conversation.
Dan, I appreciate it. I appreciate the vulnerability in failure and us being able to have this conversation in this space here today. Thank you so much.
No worries. Now, I often, with my guests, invite them to share an email for others to reach out. But since you are leading half of America's mental skills coaches and God knows how many sports, I won't necessarily invite you to do that because I'm sure you're stunningly busy, but you've got an active Twitter timeline. I don't know if you've got any other social media that you utilize. So it would be wonderful if you were able to share your Twitter handle with those listening in so that they can follow you.
Absolutely. I would welcome any conversation on this or any other topic in the field. I love being able to be a part of the field and supporting it. So both on Twitter and Instagram, my username is Lindsey, Lindsey08H. In both of those environments. So you can find me there. And please don't hesitate to email. It is lindsey.hamilton@img.com. I will say I am not terribly active on LinkedIn. So I apologize for all those people that message me there and I get back to you 9 months later. I do get back to you, although it takes some time. So that email address is the best one to reach me at via email, but I am active on Twitter and other platforms and would welcome any conversation.
Brilliant. Lindsey, thank you so much for today.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.